Do you want to know how to read and edit parameters in Revit using Dynamo? Well, you've come to the right place. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Sheer, your AEC tech girl, and in today's episode, we're diving deep into working with Revit data and editing the data of Revit Elements in part 6 of my Getting Started with Dynamo series. This is an essential skill for anyone looking to harness the full power of Revit and Dynamo. We'll cover three main parts: reading parameters from Revit, changing parameters of Revit elements, and transferring parameter data between Revit elements. All right, let's get started. First, let's talk about reading parameters from Revit elements. Parameters in Revit hold crucial information about the elements in your model, and being able to read these parameters is the first step in data manipulation. You probably already know that there are two types of parameters in Revit: instance parameters and type parameters. The way to read them and edit them in Dynamo is a bit different for each type, but Dynamo does allow you to get and edit both types. I will show you how to read both instance and type parameters, and then later in the episode, we will review how to edit them as well. Let's first start off with instance parameters and how Dynamo reads instance parameters. We will need to select some Revit elements to read their parameters. If you recall from the previous episode on selecting Revit elements, there are many ways of selecting elements. Let's go to our Revit library, then selection. For this example, let's just focus on one element to make this easier. We will use the select model element node, then select an element in our model. I am in the 2025 Snowden sample model for reference, and I will just, select this door. Now that we have our element, we can look at how Dynamo reads the parameters. In the Revit library, we will navigate to Elements, then Element. Here, there is a node called Get Parameter Value by Name. Before we move on, let's grab a watch node and connect it so we can see the data. I will right-click on the canvas and search for the watch node and connect it. We already have our element, so let's connect the output port of our select model element node to the input port of the get parameter value by name node. The other input we need is the name of the parameter. If you hover over the parameter name input port, you will see the type of data it needs, which is a string. There are a few ways you can do this. You can either simply use a string node or a code block and type the name of the parameter if you know what it is. Let's read the mark of the door in this example. Let's grab a string node and a code block to see the difference. When typing the parameter name, case does matter, as this is case sensitive. If you mistype or incorrectly capitalize a letter, it will not read it correctly. Once you type the name of the parameter correctly, then it will instantly read the values if you have automatic set for your run mode. Let's also use the code block, and remember, when needing a string in the code block, the text must be in quotation marks. Look, that wasn't that hard. But what if you weren't sure of the parameter name or even what parameters the element has or doesn't, and didn't want to go back into Revit to look for it? Let's head back to our Revit library, Elements, and then Element. If you scroll down to the nodes that query data, then you will see a Parameters node. This node gets all parameters of an element. Grab that and connect our element. Now grab a watch node and let's see our parameters of our door element. We get a list of all the project parameters of this element and its values. You might notice that this list is, missing some information. It's missing some type parameter information. It's showing me all instance parameters, but the type parameters only appear if they are project type parameters, not family type parameters. For example, I can't read my width and height parameters if I select the door and look at the type parameters that it has. Also, if I try to type that into the string parameter that we used earlier, it won't return any value. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that getting and modifying these parameters are different. The reason it is so different to get the type parameters and the instance parameters is because Dynamo is getting the parameters of the element. And technically, the type parameters are not necessarily part of the individual element, but rather part of the element type. You therefore need to first get the element type and then the parameters of that type. We will use the same node to get the values, but we will need a node in between to get the element type. Go to the Revit library, then Elements, then Element. And in the Query Data section, there is an element type node. This will get the element type from the element, and then you can use that to get the list of type parameters. Connect the element output to the element type input, and then use that in between the get parameter values by name or parameters nodes. Now we can type in width in the string and see that it gets the correct type parameter value. Play around with other type parameters or instance parameters and see how to use these different nodes to get your values. Now that we can read parameters, let's move on to changing them. This is incredibly useful and powerful for making batch updates to your model or automating those repetitive tasks. Let's use the example of needing to add a prefix to our room numbers and use, our levels for that prefix. We will need to get some parameter values like our room numbers and their levels, combine them, and then set the values back to Revit. First things first, let's get all our rooms. Go to the Revit library, then selection, and we will select all elements of a category. Then grab our categories node as well and select rooms. Here's a tip. If you start typing rooms after selecting the dropdown, it works as a search, making it easier than just scrolling through to find the category you need. Let's connect our output port to our input port and see that it selected all the rooms in our model. Okay, next we have to get those two values, the room number and the level. I usually like to use the parameter node to see what I'm working with on a whole. We will go to Revit, Elements, and Element in our library and grab the parameters node and our handy dandy watch node. I'm going to scroll down and just check to verify the name of these parameters. We have number and we have level. Perfect. Now we can use the get parameter values by name node. We will also grab two string nodes and a watch node. Let's type in the parameter names into our string nodes, number and level. You will notice only one input port for the parameter name. So we will need to combine these two string nodes into one so that we can input both of them into that one port. So we will need to create a list. Let's go to our list library and then generate and grab the list create node. If you remember from our previous episode, we can use the plus and minus button on the node to add or remove input ports. We'll just add one, then connect it to the parameter name port. Now you will see in our watch that it's not really producing what we want. We know we have 55 rooms, but it's only outputting one room number and level. Here is where we are going to change the lacing and the levels to get our desired output. First thing we notice is that it's only producing two values. That's because the lacing is set to auto, which is the shortest lacing, and we need it to read the longest, so it's getting the value from all elements. Right-click the node and change the lacing to longest. Now it is producing 55 values, but it's kind of mixing the number and the level. We need a separate list for our number and a separate list for our level. Now, all we have to do is change our levels for our elements. Select the little arrow and check levels on. Now we get the correct output where we have list 0 with all 55 room numbers and list 1 with all 55 levels or all 55 of our rooms. Second step is complete. Now let's look at how to manipulate this data to get the values we need. We will first separate these lists out to work with them individually. Go to List, then Inspect. There are just two sublists, so we can keep it simple and use the first item and last item nodes. Now we have all our room numbers separated from our room levels. When looking at the list of levels, you might notice that the naming varies. And we want to essentially use just the first two characters as an identification of the level and prefix the room number with that level identifier or level code. In order to do that, we must modify the string value of the level names. Let's go to the string library, then modify, and we will grab the substring node. Here there are three inputs needed. The string, we will connect our list of levels values. Then it needs a start index and a length. When hovering over these inputs, you can see that it is asking for an integer. We could use a few options here for an input. We could use a number node, an input slider, a number slider, or our handy dandy code block node. I like to just use a code block to reduce the amount of nodes needed. If I used one of the other options, I would need 2 nodes for the 2 different values needed, but with the code block, I can just use the 1 node. So it just helps me keep things clean and organized. Plus, I know the values aren't changing here. I will double click on the canvas to get the code block, and for the start index, I know it's 0 because it's the beginning of the string, and since we are grabbing 2 characters, I'll enter and add a 2. Now we have 2 outputs from our code block that I will connect to get the substring. All right, this is looking pretty good. They are mostly all correct, but for my identifiers, I like them to be all uppercase. We can easily do that as well. If we look back at our string and modify library, there is a node called upper. Now all my prefixes for my level are good to go. The next step is combining this prefix with the original room number. These are 2 lists that we are looking to combine. There are actually lots of ways of doing this, but personally I like to keep it simple and just use the addition node. That's right, the addition node isn't just for adding 2 numbers, but you can also use it to combine different types of values like strings. Let's go to Math Operators and grab that addition node. Let's put our level identifier in the X input port and the room numbers in the Y input port. Again, I could also use a code block to do this. So let's go ahead and grab a code block and do the same thing. I will double click on the canvas to grab the code block and then type in X plus Y. Connect our list to it and you can see that we get the same result. Now, I show you this because we can add a bit more complexity to it. For example, maybe I want a divider between these 2 values, like a underscore or a dash, for example. I can add that to my code block. Let's modify this equation we wrote in our code block to add the divider. It will now read X plus quote dash quote plus Y, because the dash, it needs to be in quotation marks. The reason a dash is in quotes is because we are adding it as a string and we want the code block to read the dash as a string and not as a minus symbol. There are many ways this could have been done, but this is the method I prefer as I try to use as few nodes as possible to keep my Dynamo graph clean. Now that we have the new values we want, we need to do the last step, which is sending this data back to Revit to update our room number values. Before we continue, I want to change the run mode from automatic to manual so that we won't unintentionally run it before all the inputs are set. Just like we have the get parameter values by name, there is a similar node called set parameter by name, which is what we will use to update those room numbers. We will go to the Revit library, then elements, and grab the set parameter by name node. This requires 3 inputs, the element, parameter name, and values. We already have all this information in our Dynamo graph. We just have to find it and connect the wires. For the elements, we have those values from the beginning of our graph from the node all elements of a category. Just grab an additional wire and connect it to the set parameter by name node. Next, the parameter name. We also have that already from when we got the value from the rooms. We can use the same string node with the parameter name number and connect the wire. And lastly, the value. This will be the new value we want to set for all our room numbers. Let's grab a wire out of the code block with the new concatenated values of the level code with room number and connect it. Now that all our inputs are set, let's hit run at the bottom right. We must do that since we switched the run mode to manual. And done! All our rooms are renumbered. Now that we learned to read parameter values from Revit Elements and set or modify parameter values of Revit Elements, let's look at the last part of this episode, transferring parameter data between Revit Elements. Sometimes you need to transfer parameter data from one element to another. This can be useful for maintaining consistency and ensuring that related elements share the same information. In this example, I'm going to transfer my wall fire rating to the doors. Now, this has a few layers to it. One, the wall fire rating is a type parameter. And in this example, I have created a custom instance parameter for the door fire rating. I want my door fire rating to be an instance parameter so that I can have the same door type on different walls that have different fire ratings without needing to change the door type. What we will do is identify what wall the door is hosted to, read the fire rating from the wall, and then transfer it to the instance parameter of the door. Simple enough, although you'll soon see that it's not that simple at all. All right, let's get started. Well, first we need to select our walls since that's where we are getting our values from. Go to the Revit library, then selection, and same as in the last example, all elements of a category. Then we will get our category node and select walls. We know that for the walls, the fire rating parameter is a type parameter. So we need to get the element type of our walls like we did in the beginning of the episode. In our Revit library, go to Elements, and grab the element type node and connect. Now we have our wall types and we can use the get parameter value by name node to get the fire rating. In the same library, we will scroll up and grab the get parameter value by name node. And then I will right click on the canvas and use the search to grab a string node and type in fire rating. Remember, it is case sensitive. You can, if you wish, to grab a watch node as well. Now connect everything and we will have all our fire rating values. First step is done. Now for the doors. We need to figure out which doors are hosted on these walls. There's actually a special node for this. In that same elements library, there is a node called Get Host Elements. We'll use the node to get all the doors hosted on the walls. Don't worry about the empty lists. It just means that some of the walls don't have any elements hosted to them. Now that we have our list of hosted elements, we want to filter this list to only the walls that have doors on them. This list is giving us the elements, so we need to determine the category. We can go to Revit Elements, and use the node Get Category. Now we need to determine if the wall contains a door. Let's go to our list library, then inspect, and grab the Contains node. We then need our Categories node from the Revit selection library. We will select doors and connect our wires. Now we need to modify the list level and bam, we get our Boolean values. We can now use these Boolean values to filter our lists of hosted elements from walls. If you remember, Booleans are simply true and false values. Go to the list library and modify and grab the filter by Boolean mask node. This node is used to filter one list by a Boolean list, so it's perfect for what we're about to do. We will connect our Boolean list to the mask input and connect the elements to the list input. We can grab a watch node and connect the output port to the watch. Now we have a filtered list. We also want to filter the walls to get only the fire rating from the walls with the doors to keep everything matching. So we will just copy the filter by Boolean mask node using Control on the keyboard and dragging the node. Then we will connect our walls to the list port and reconnect the port to the element type so that it's now getting the fire rating from the filtered list. Perfect. I know this is getting a bit complicated, but we are almost there. Give me a moment as I clean things up a bit and group my nodes. Okay, so now we have just the walls that contain doors, but some of the walls have doors and other categories hosted to it. Now I want to get the categories and filter this to remove all elements that aren't doors. We'll do something very similar except use our equal node. We will use the same get category node, so we will copy that over and connect it from our filtered list here. The equal node requires a string. So we will go to the string library, then generate, and use the string from object node. Because we are using strings, I can just grab a string node, which I will right click and search for and type in the category name, which is doors. Then use my math operator equals to determine which elements are in fact a door. We get another list of Boolean values, and again can use the filter by Boolean mask node to filter the elements. Now we finally have a list of all our doors from our hosted walls. We are ready to set the parameter values of these doors. We can go to the Revit library, then Elements and Element, and grab the Set Parameter by Name node. Let's make sure again to first set our run mode from automatic to manual. Now we can connect the doors to the element input. We can grab the list of the fire ratings we got from the walls and connect it to the value input. And I will lastly grab a string node and type in the name of the parameter. I create a parameter called door fire rating from wall, so I will type that. Now, before I hit run, I just want to explain one thing. The reason this will work and apply the correct fire rating to the doors has to do with the list levels here. You will see that the list of fire rating values from the walls is just in one list, but the list of doors is in sublists per wall it's hosted on. So all doors within that sublist will get the same fire rating from the corresponding wall. Okay. Let's hit run and check our doors in our model to see what happened. We can see the doors got the correct fire rating from the walls. Let's check a few more and see which doors got what fire rating and make sure that it's correct. All right, perfect. That wasn't too difficult, was it? And that's it for today's episode on working with Revit data and editing Revit elements. We covered how to read parameters, how to change them, like renumbering our rooms, and how to transfer data between elements, like fire rating from our walls to our doors, all using Dynamo. I hope you find this tutorial helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments what topics you'd like to see next. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay empowered, stay inspired, and always challenge what is possible.